looking at these constructions in English. These this is sort of a classic problem in English where we have these constructions that look superficially the same, but are quite different in terms of their behavior, and we have to understand them in terms of their syntactic structure as well as their semantic structure. So we have these are just two examples. Seems. There are other verbs like this, like appears and happens, and sometimes it's the verb be plus an adjective will work this way. So be likely. And then there's a bunch of verbs that are like intend. So it would be things like try, intend, hope, and there's a variety of these. So they would be mostly verbs of cognition of some kind. One of the things that we notice about them that's different, so we talked about some things last time, but another thing that's different about them is what happens when you passivize the verb of the embedded infinitival verb. So in general, if you have a transitive verb, there's a passive form that corresponds to it. So the boy ate a donut. A donut was eaten by the boy. You can turn it into a passive sentence, and the key thing about passive sentences is that they ordinarily have the same interpretation as the active. So active and passive versions of the same sentence are interpreted the same way. If we have the man watched the movie was watched by the man. We have the same interpretation. There was a watcher and an agent and a theme argument. There's two arguments of that verb. Passive allows you to express the theme or patient generally as the subject syntactically. It's in the subject position. And then if you do express the agent, it's in a by phrase. So here we have a passive construction with embedded under a raising verb. So the president seems. I'm going to use I just picked seduce because it's a good transitive verb. Right? And I don't know. I was thinking about just a typical president, right? They get into trouble with interns. So I actually don't have anything particular in mind here. But and seduce is just a really good transitive verb, so it works well for this. But you can substitute obviously any transitive verb in here, and you get the same results. So the key thing about this is that we get a different interpretation of the passive, whether or not you have active or passive in the embedded verb. That's the key thing in the embedded IP. You get a different interpretation under control in the control construction, but you don't get a different interpretation with the raising construction is the key thing. So we have the president seems to have been seduced by the intern. It means the same thing as the intern seems to have seduced the president. So what we've done here is to passivize the seduce part, right? There's an active and passive version of the part that's seduced. Because there's raising, that will cause whatever would be the subject by passivization, right? Whether it's active or passive, seduce will have a different subject, but whatever that is will end up being the subject of seems because this is a raising construction, right? So there's passive in the embedded clause with consequences for the main clause. But right, these mean the same thing. There's no difference in meaning. They would be true under the same set of circumstances. There might be a little bit of difference in meaning in terms of what you're focusing attention on when you're thinking of the scenario, but it's negligible, the difference between those. Whereas if you say the president intends to be seduced by the intern, means something quite different from the intern intends to seduce the president. So obviously, again, because there's no overt subject in the embedded phrase, you're going to always get, you have to have, the situation has to be one in which whatever would be the subject of the embedded phrase shows up on the surface in terms of what the interpretation you get shows up on the surface in both cases as the subject of the main verb, right? But the claim is that's for different reasons. In the raising case, that's because you took the subject from the embedded verb and you moved it up into an empty subject slot. In the control case, no, you have a different scenario. You don't have an empty subject slot in the main clause, right? What you have instead is an empty pronoun is what you have at some level in the embedded clause. So we have so you look at the semantics. We have seduce. It has two arguments, two semantic arguments: an actor, an undergoer or agent and patient, seducer and the seducee, and in the passive clause, the seducer is not the subject of the passivized verb, right? It's going to be either simply omitted, so you could say that the president seems to have been seduced would be fine, right? So one option for passive is don't even mention the agent, right? But if you do mention it, then the agent comes in a by phrase, it's in some kind of adjunct position in the embedded clause. And the seducer is inserted into the, it would be the patient is, we're not showing this, right? But it actually would be necessarily inserted where? Given the general principles. Agent gets inserted as specifier of the verb. Patient gets inserted as complement of the verb. So I'm not showing this here. You would actually put it in the complement position. The passive transformation is like the unaccusative transformation. The object moves into the subject slot. Why does it do that? Because the subject slot is empty in the passive construction. The passive construction, what it does is to empty the subject slot. And then, because you have to have a subject for every clause, that's part of the principles. But in any case, the important thing here is that it ends up in there's a lot of movement going on, right? The patient of seduce is inserted in the complement position, then it moves to the subject position of the clause that it's in, and then that's all movement that's happening. But the part that's called raising is when you move out of a clause into a higher clause. So raising has been used to indicate that particular scenario. So we have seems has only one argument that's expressed, which is the P argument or the clausal argument, the proposition, and that's expressed as the embedded IP. And it's an IP, the category IP, because there's a to. We need to have someplace to put that to, and the to is the thing that indicates lack of, right? All of this stuff is part of there's a lot of assumptions here about how this all works, but went through like evidence for why you would want it to be in the I slot. And then the raising is that part, moves up into the main clause. So notice that the meaning of this, it seems that there was a case of intern seducing president, right? We're going to get that meaning independently of whether there's raising or not, or what raises. Because notice, right? Because because basically all of the meaning here is coming from the embedded clause, and when you passivize a clause, you don't change the meaning. If I passivize a clause and then move the subject up to the main clause position, I'm not changing the meaning. Seems doesn't change the meaning of anything underneath it. Right? That's what it's transparent to any clause internal processes of the embedded clause. It just adds, it seems like, to whatever the content is that you've got. But intends is different, right? Because intends, there's a seducer and a seducee, and those are going to be, again, the same thing. The agent is expressed in a by phrase. the patient moves up out of the VP into the subject slot, and then moves into the subject slot right here. I'm showing it as being, there's a DP. DP that is an empty pronoun. That capitalized pro means a certain kind of pronominal element. And it moves into the subject of IP clause, but it doesn't move anywhere else under this analysis, right? What instead intend has two arguments, the embedded proposition and the intender. Now that's the key difference, right? There's an intender argument of intent. There's nothing, whatever there is in seems is not even being expressed and not being influenced by any of this. So that means that the consequence of that is that we're going to, the situation is that of control. There's a rule that says, if you're the subject in this kind of a scenario, then you determine, the subject of those control verbs determines the interpretation of the null pronoun. And so that's what control is called. And because of that, you're going to get the interpretation for the sentence will depend on whether or not there's passivization. Since the intender must be interpreted as the subject of the embedded clause, right? Then the interpretation will depend on what the subject is. If it's the subject of the embedded clause is the patient, then the patient of seduce is the intender. If it's an active clause, then you get the opposite result. So the interpretation of the sentence depends, crucially, the president intends for there to be a case of intern seducing president is the meaning of the structure on the board, right, on the slide here. If we change it to the intern being the intender, right? Here we're not going to change anything for the seems case, right? Because we're still going to have the intern is going to be the actor, the president is going to be the patient in the active clause as well. We move that actor up into the subject of seems clause, and we still get the same interpretation that we had with the passive version, right? No change in meaning. But with the other construction, we get a different result because the actor, the seducer, is now the subject of the embedded clause, and that must be interpreted as being the same as the intender, right? Because it's not raising. Okay, long story short, we get a different meaning. The intern intends for there to be a case of intern seducing president. Whereas if we passivize it, we're going to get the president intends that, right? Because we change we change what gets interpreted as intender by what we do to the embedded clause. Okay, so that's the way that raising works. And control. So there's a difference, raising versus control. And I want to take us back to small clauses with the verb imagine to show that you can get, well, what would you expect if you have a clausal thing underneath imagine with a missing subject? I want you to imagine, can we do that? I want you to imagine your brother to be sleeping. Can you do that? No. What would you do instead? I want you to imagine to be sleeping. We can't do that, right? But if you could do that, would that be a case of raising or of control? I want you to imagine to be sleeping. We would expect that to mean imagine yourself to be sleeping, right? And in which case that would be a scenario of control, right? Not of raising. Why? Because imagine has an imaginer argument, right? And that imaginer argument is what's its subject. So we would expect there to be control. But you don't get control in the same way. We could do this, right? We could have a CP. The intern can imagine to seduce the president. Bad, right? Can't do that. We can do it with a DP, but we'd have to change things around in order to get the meaning we want. But we could also do it. We can also do it this way, right? The intern can't imagine her mother seducing the president. So we have this other construction. Why can't we just use the to construction? Who knows, right? But we do, but that's just part of the grammar of English, that we have these constructions that are built around in, that have clausal properties in some sense, right? That we've talked about before. So, and then what's going to happen here, right? If we wanted to do something with an empty subject there, could we do it? Well, yeah. The intern can't imagine seducing the president, right? Can do that. That's fine, right? We don't need to have the subject of the embedded verb expressed. So it's the same thing, right? But it's the same thing as the control construction, not the same thing as the raising construction. And when we know that, just make the calculation. It's a difference in meaning, right? The imagine is more like intend than it is like seen, or be likely, or whatever, right? Because there is, imagine means do something with your mind, and then the complement is the content of what you do with your mind, right? Okay, so we have seduce. It has two arguments. It can go. It's just going. The difference here, going into a verb phrase with an ing verb, right? And then it can have a subject. So her mother seducing the president. And then instead of putting it into a clause, because we can't get the to, we're saying, well, it would make sense. It's sort of like saying, imagine her be seducing the president, right? But we just leave out the be because it's not. You don't have any be determiner form, but the meaning is there anyway, and so we get it to go into a DP. So this would be a small clause, kind of small clause. There's more than one kind. This would be a DP small clause. The hypothesis is so it's just like why does it mean the same thing that it would mean if you said, I want you to imagine your mother to be seducing the president, right? It means the same thing because that's what it is, right? It's just that the grammatical content is different for whatever reason. Okay, so we can have the intern can't imagine her mother seducing the president, perfectly fine. So I'm just collapsing that a little bit. The intern can't imagine seducing the president. We get the meaning we get necessarily. Here's the key thing, right? We necessarily get the meaning the intern can't imagine herself seducing the president. There can be no other interpretation, right? And so that's the control scenario where there should be a subject, there's a verb. Maybe there's a to, maybe there isn't. Here's a case where there is no to. But in that situation, you would typically have it, or if the subject is missing for that verb, then you necessarily interpret it, recover it from the other thing. The intern can't imagine there being a good solution. That's fine, right? Can't imagine there being a solution to this problem. Seems fine, right? We can do it like that, where we have a there subject of the embedded small clause, right? But you can't. You don't have raising because there's no such thing as there. Can't imagine being a good solution, right? So we go through the test for difference between raising and control, and they systematically play themselves out. The intern can't imagine it raining much longer. That's fine. It's fine to because imagine is putting no semantic restriction on the arguments of the verb, right? That's another thing to notice here, right? Imagine doesn't care what you put underneath there. It will take any structure that could be a sentence, but it will be a sentence in a reduced form. It's a reduced kind of clause. This is actually just a thing that happens in language after language. There are some languages for which you would only get a nominalized clause in this scenario, in any embedded clause scenario. So if you're going to do an embedded clause in some languages, you make it be nominal. And what English doesn't quite do that. It has these infinitival things with a to in it, or it has kind of semi-nominal verbs. The ing thing does something to a verb that makes it more adjective-like, it sort of floats across categories very easily, right? It's sort of, and some people would consider this to be, I don't know, people get confused, right? Is this gerund? What does gerund mean anyway? And gerund is a noun form of a, there's all this stuff that people get all, but what we're saying here that, yeah, it is sort of nominal in that it's all a DP, right? And so the whole thing sort of fits together. It can't imagine raising much longer. Horrible, right? Because the problem is that imagine has to have its argument. There can't be raising here. The intern can't imagine the shit hitting the fan like that. I guess fine. The shit can't imagine hitting the fan. Horrible, right? The intern can't imagine being seduced by the president. So here's the key one, right? Because the other ones are, well, you could say whatever, but that doesn't mean the same thing as the intern can't imagine seducing the president. Completely different meaning. Because in the first case, the intern is interpreted as the patient of seduce, right? And in the second case, the agent of seduce. And so that's because we've got control. Both the interns can imagine being seduced by the president. Now this is a tricky one, right? But if you think about it, that can mean independently, they don't even know anything about this. They can each imagine themselves alone being seduced by the president. But if we put the both down in the embedded clause, then you have a scenario where you're seeing the interns as imagining both of them as being seduced, right? Imagining two seducings going on. The first one might be compatible with that interpretation, but it doesn't yield that. The second one does, right? So this is a relatively subtle difference, but it is an interesting one because we can see that both can be put down in that embedded clause, right? Even under imagine. I mean, it's not really even very comfortable there, but it can be done. But then the fact that it yields a slightly different interpretation is what's interesting. Whereas with the raising sorts of constructions, we get that both sitting down there, giving us evidence for there being raising, right? But you get exactly the same interpretation. There's no difference at all in the meaning that you get. Okay, so all of the evidence supports the hypothesis that what we've got here is an empty. We can have, actually, it's kind of interesting because you can put the reflexive pronoun in there, can't you? She can't imagine herself being seduced. That's fine, right? But you don't need to because so you can put the reflexive pronoun in. So how is it that it can be in that position? Is an interesting question at all with a reflexive pronoun. The general condition on reflexive pronouns is you've got to be in the same clause. Well, but wait a minute, it doesn't seem to be in the same clause, but it's still somehow. So we're going to have to work that all out. We're going to work on that today a little bit. How is it that we could even have a reflexive in such a position? But you don't need to have it. You can just have emptiness and get the same exact interpretation. So that's what control is. We get empty reflexive pronouns, essentially. I don't know why I'm doing this again. I just did this already, right? We got the whole thing here, seduce. The DP has to be an argument of seduce. It gets embedded there. We have imagine is different from other verbs in that it just says, well, I have notice what the key thing about these verbs is they have a proposition argument because the meaning of their argument is the same thing as a clause. But they have a requirement that it be one of these DP small clauses. So it's semi-clause-like and semi-noun phrase-like. And then you fill it all in like that, and we've got all of the pieces coming together in a fairly straightforward way. Now, to make life more difficult, as if it weren't bad enough, we not only have subject control, but also object control. And not only raising to subject, but raising to object. And so things can get even more complicated and difficult to describe. Here's a prototypical object control verb, persuade. And you could say it has a lexical conceptual structure. Boiling down the meaning to the key parts would be something like this. There's some kind of a communicative act. Persuade, it may not be say, exactly, because you could probably, I don't know, could persuade someone with writing, but when you write something, you're saying something in writing, right? I don't know. But it's some kind of act of communication, right? So that act, say, just means act of communication. And there are two arguments. There's the communicator, or the sender of the communication, and the recipient of that. And so that's that's a key part of the story, right? Is that object control verbs have three arguments: subject, agent type argument, object patient type argument, and then a P argument. And what the control is going to be, the subject of the P is going to be empty and determined by the object of the rather than the subject. So we've got the senator persuaded the president. Still got senators and presidents because you can talk about them and say all kinds of shit about them and nobody cares, right? Because it's just normal. We get Bill Maher in here, and he'd go way farther than I do, but we're not even going to. I think we won't even do. Well, maybe we will do seduce. I don't know. But we've got the senator persuaded the president, and then we've got something missing. There's another part there that has to be put in, and for the time being, we're assuming that it's got to be a complement, right? Because there's these three arguments. All of the pieces have to be there. I don't think you could say that. Could you come in out of the clear blue sky and someone said, "What happened today?" "Oh, my mother persuaded me." Not good, right? You could only do that if it was some kind of ellipsis where you'd already given the content. So that's clearly an argument. And it's going to have the form of an infinitival to clause. So the senator persuaded the president to lie. Oh, I should have not that to in the bottom one, right? That's just a typo there. It should be to, and the verb phrase entire it's not to lie, right? So just, ignore that. It's just to lie. There's an intransitive verb there. There's a triangle there because I'm not showing you any of the details. And the actor of lie would be by the rules would be in the specifier of VP slot. And then by the general rules would have to move up into the specifier of IP slot. But it will be an empty pronoun here, a empty pronominal element, right? Because here you can't even fill it in. There's not even any possibility, right? Senator persuaded the president. Can you do it with that he should lie? Convinced the president that he should lie. That'd be fine, right? Persuaded the president that he should lie. I don't think you can even do that, can you? No, this one says, so these verbs will differ. Some of them say, well, you can be a CP complement. That's okay. Others say, no, you can't. Sorry, no, you can only be this. I have to have an IP complement. I'm not showing this here for the lexical entry. I'm keeping it fairly simple, but we have persuade would have a P propositional argument that is, and something else you'd have to put in there is that, and I have to be an IP. So this is the scenario where we have control, right? We've got the same value for the president and now what's hard about this, right, is that we say, well, why can't you just say that the president is the subject of the infinitive and there's no argument there? And the answer is that the evidence doesn't add up to that. You wouldn't get the right results in terms of constituency and in terms of everything else. Remember that one of our principles is that that so far seems to work is that the arguments, the semantic arguments of a verb, are necessarily either complements in complement position or specifier position. Therefore, if we've got three arguments here, right, and it wouldn't make sense to say that there are there's just a proposition argument, right? Because there is some person that gets persuaded. That's part of the meaning of the thing, right? But I think we just look at the constituency evidence. What the senator persuaded was the president to lie. Is that any good? No. Why is that no good? Well, because that's not a constituent, the president to lie. The president is outside of the embedded clause, right? So that's just one kind of evidence that you could use to support this. It persuaded that the president lied. No, that's no good. Why? Because, among other things, persuade requires a persuadee argument, and that would be missing here. It persuaded the president lying. No good either, right? So there's no, you have to have a persuader and a persuadee. The senator persuaded there to be a discussion about the matter. Now, we know that there to be a discussion about the matter is a possible IP, right? I would like for there to be a discussion about the matter. It's perfectly fine, right? So the possibility of having a there phrase inside of an IP there's nothing that prevents that in principle. If it were the case that this was just an embedded IP without a persuadee argument, then we would expect this sentence to be okay, but it's not okay, right? And we account for it being not okay by the assumption that the DP in the slot here that's occupied by the president is in that slot. It's not inside the embedded clause. Even though, and so here's where it gets hard, right? There are cases that we would analyze as raising to object that would have exactly this form. So just to give you an example, the senator expected there to be a discussion about that matter. It's perfectly fine, right? So expect, unlike persuade, has simply an IP argument, right? It has a propositional argument that is realized as an IP, and there is no expector argument, a person or something that would be, right? So then that's fine. We can take an IP like that and embed it under expect, and we get, what we want. So the control construction will disallow things like there, dummy it and dummy there cannot be in the object slot in a control construction. The senators persuaded it to rain, same thing, right? Whereas with expect, that's fine, right? We all expect it to rain today, right? Where we have it's superficially the same thing, but the expect construction puts no constraints whatsoever on the content of the embedded IP. The senator persuaded this shit to hit the fan. No good, right? All of these things. The senator persuaded the intern to seduce the president is okay, but it means something different. Not the same interpretation that you get with the senator persuaded the president to be seduced by the by the intern, sorry. So the whole range of evidence, the same kind of evidence that you would appeal to distinguish raising to subject and subject control happens with object position. Okay, now we're going to go, staying really sort of in the same domain, but going deeper into the theory of reference, of how elements in the clause can refer to things in the world. So that's what reference is about, right? So the relationship between syntactic phrases and the objects that they refer to, and what the constraints. So there's a whole theory, sub-theory of generative grammar and of syntactic theories in general that has to do with the constraints on what sort of elements can be related to each other in a system of co-reference, where two different DPs can have the same reference value. That's what we're concerned with. And this is the general term for this in generative grammar is binding theory. Binding theory has to do with the relationships between these things. And this goes back, this is a tradition that you still find in current generative grammar, but it goes all the way back into the early days in some form. It was concerned with when you have co-reference or not. So the control constructions are cases of co-referential elements in the clause would be the idea. And by the way, the control scenario was handled in classic transformational grammar as a case of putting in two NPs or DPs. They didn't call them DPs. Two DPs that were equivalent in content and in value, right? So you would have actually done the president persuaded the intern to seduce the senator, right? Where you'd have copies of the same DP, and then there was a rule that said it's called equivalent noun phrase deletion. It said, oh, well, you are the same. We'll delete the second of you, right? So you get the same result, right? It's in there because the semantics say it has to be in there, but you come along and wipe it out with a transformation of deletion or all of these things are sort of equivalent, right? There's an empty pronoun, or there's something there and you delete it, right? You get the same overall result. So we've got these DPs in here, and Mary would be, and Tom, and would be a certain kind of DP that we would call a referring expression, because so we've got lie is the embedded clause here. We have a P. So the embedded clause here again is going to be X saying something to Y causes proposition to happen, right? That's the way we read that, right? That's what persuasion is. Say something to someone else in such a way as to cause something to happen. P means something happens, right? And so lie is then has its own arguments, but one of them is an empty pronominal element. So the colors here are going to be red means referring expression, and blue means pronominal element, where pronominal is a vague term, meaning pronominal in general is just going to mean I don't have intrinsic reference. I get my reference from something else. And so then we've got lie only has one argument, right? It would be probably act lie or something like that, right? And it doesn't really matter. We've got one argument, and that's instantiated in the syntax by Jim. So our expressions are referentially independent DPs, right? They don't their value, what they're referring to in the world, is not determined by the sentence structure. It's determined by whatever you want it to mean. Mary, in our conversational context, there's a person named Mary, and we can use a sentence to refer to that person. So those are we can. Doing here. So we can think of it as being the case that there are, That's kind of that's kind of interesting, right? Think of it, what it, as being the case. It is the case. What I've done raising to object of a preposition there. That's kind of cool, right? Because it is the case that, right? But we can think of it as being the case, right? Where I've moved that. I guess maybe it's not. Anyway, so if you keep going with this, right, you can eventually you could spend lots of time doing this. We had a speaker yesterday that or a speaker in our lecture series yesterday that you guys probably should come to. It was kind of interesting. That was working on a Native American language in Northern California, and this lady is like zooming in with all this kind of crap on this language that was studied by some of the greats in linguistics over the past 50 years, whatever, and they have records of what people. She's working with a couple of old people that are 70 years old, and you've got this language that has way more complexity in some level than English would ever have, but you can still you can see how it could be processed in the same system, even though there are lots of anyway. So you could if you start doing this stuff, you start going crazy, right? After a while, and you start thinking of things like, oh, I can say. You can think of it as being the case. Well, how can I do that, right? Is it raising? Is it? And maybe that should be your project, right? We can do that as one of them. So here's what we're doing is we're saying, well, okay, these things have different values. Their referential values can be indicated by numbers, and when the numbers are the same, then we interpret them as being the same. And then we could separate out the indices that we put on things. So those I and J and things, those could be thought of as, and I'm just doing this because the textbook does this, right? The I's and J's can just indicate that you are traces of something. So if something moves, it leaves a trace behind. Those are indexed, right? But the referential value you could index in a different way with numbers, right? And the numbers would just be arbitrary, but the system would have to be one in which sameness of number indicates sameness of reference. So here, Jim in this construction refers necessarily to someone other than Tom or Mary. And some of these things are going to be guaranteed by the nature of the structure. Whether you can be interpreted as the same as something else will be determined by that. And there are constraints on pronouns of different kinds in terms of what kind of structures they can be in such that there is this co-reference where they can share the same number value. And then pronominal elements are referentially dependent DPs. So the one kind of pronominal element would be this pro. It is, and then there's some kind of control principle. The object DP of a causative verb that has this, which here's what the facts are. A causative verb that has a non-finite complement has the same referential value as the subject of the complement, which necessarily has no phonetic form, is what the facts are, right? So what that means is that Tom has the same referential value as the subject of that embedded IP, and the subject of that embedded IP has to be pro, no phonetic form whatsoever, not pronounced. Okay, and then what we could do is, just for simplicity, what we'll do is we can just put the indices on these things, the I's and the J's and K's, just as a shortcut, and not go through all. There would be technical reasons for maybe separating those things out, but there's really no reason to in what we're doing. So I'm just going to do it like this, right? Just to keep it separate. But we do note that there are different kinds of things, whether you're an R expression or a pronominal element. And then we have ordinary pronouns that can be co-referential with another DP in the same sentence. So in the same sentence means the same big structure, right? Not the same clause, not Not necessarily, right? So we can have, we can put in here in this slot, we can put a pronoun, right? So we could put her, and that her can get its value from Mary, right? So pronouns are these things that are referentially dependent. You have to get their referential value has to be gotten from something else. They don't have an inherent referential value. Mary, on the other hand, does, right? Or the boy sitting over there, all of those things. So anything that's not pronominal, the R expressions, names, and other kinds of full DPs would not have this character. We have to figure out what her refers to, or is co-referential with. But they can't, so the constraint here is that they can be co-referential with another DP in the same sentence, but not if they're antecedent. So the antecedent is a technical term here that means thing you get your value from if you're a referential, if you're a dependent element or a pronominal element of some kind. But you can't do it if their antecedent is too close. So if we say, Mary persuaded Tom to lie about him, Mary persuaded Tom to lie about him, is that okay? Where him gets its value from Tom? You'd have to say, Mary's persuaded Tom to lie about himself, right? So there's a difference between, so that's what we're concerned about, is where do you get pronouns and where do you get reflexive? Ordinary pronouns and reflexive pronouns. They can also get pronouns can get their value extrasententially, or from discourse context, or deictically. You can point to someone. Mary persuaded Tom to lie about him, and point to someone, right? Or look at them, or whatever, right? We know who we're talking about already. It doesn't have to be something in the same sentence. Reflexive pronouns, on the other hand, also can be, well, not on the other hand, they, like pronominal ordinary pronouns, reflexive pronouns can be co-referential with another DP in the same sentence, as in the case of himself here. So here we have the value of that pronoun being gotten by, this is really sort of, by the way, this is sort of quite important that we have the structures done the way that we do here. And we have that pro there in the subject position of that embedded clause. One of the pieces of evidence for having it there is that we can get a reflexive pronoun. Because in general, if you have an object reflexive pronoun, if you have a reflexive pronoun in a complement position like this, it's going to have to get its value from, in general, the schema is something in the same clause. And here we have a pro that is in the same clause that himself gets its value from. And we don't have to mess with that condition, that general condition that they be clause-mate things, right? So we don't have to say that himself is getting its value from Tom, right? That's a sort of critical thing here in terms of the overall structure of the theory. Himself is getting its referential value from pro, and pro is getting its referential value from Tom. So it's only indirectly by virtue of that route and that system that himself has the same referential value as Tom, ultimately, right? Okay. So reflexive pronouns can be co-referential with another DP in the same sentence. But this is not okay, right? Mary persuaded Tom to lie about herself. Is that good? No. Quite bad, right? Well, but why? Herself? I mean, sometimes it's kind of interesting, right? Because Well, you couldn't possibly interpret herself as going with Tom, right? Because the gender doesn't match. But that's not good enough for you to say, okay, then let it go with Mary, right? It's not good enough, right? Because there are syntactic constraints. The important thing here is that the way that pronouns and reflexives and pro and all ordinary pronouns and reflexives, the way that they work in terms of what you can interpret as going with what, that whole question has been a critical component in the way that this theory of grammar has developed. And everything, lots of things were built around what the facts are with respect to these things. So we're looking at them in some depth. It can be co-referential with another DP in the same sentence, provided that their antecedent is close enough, right? So an ordinary pronoun can't have an antecedent that's too close. Reflexive pronoun can have an antecedent provided that it is close enough, right? So herself doesn't work here because Mary is not close enough. And in general, the general schema is not in the same clause. General. We're going to refine that by looking at other cases. And it cannot be, the antecedent cannot be extrasentential. So we have to make the constraint even stronger. The reflexive pronouns must be co-referential with another DP in the same sentence that is close enough. So the constraint on reflexive pronouns is much stronger. Now, before going deeper into binding theory and what the constraints are that are consistent with the version of X-bar theory that we're using, I want to stop for a moment. I want to kind of go back and distinguish two kinds of reflexivization in languages. So one kind is the kind that you get in English, where you have reflexive pronouns that are sitting in DP slots. Presumably, they're Ds or D plus, and in English it's kind of interesting, right? It's like a D plus noun combination, historically at least, right? Herself, where self is a noun, some kind, right? And they get smushed together into a single form. And that's a very common thing. So languages will, that have that kind of reflexive element will often go to, what they usually go to is nouns that refer to body parts. A lot of them will use the term head. So literally what you're saying in Berber languages, when you use a reflexive, you're saying, if you wanted to say Tom scratched himself, you would say Tom scratched his head. Literally, right? Where the head part is still active in the language, and it means head, right? But what you mean, in fact, is Tom scratched himself, right? Where head has become. So that's a very common thing to have happen. But then another kind of reflexive is where it's really the verb itself that gets reflexivized. The verb, there's some morphology on the verb. So another really common thing to have happen is you get an affix on the verb. And that says, oh, interpret me and the clause I'm in as being a reflexive scenario, right? So in English, you can have things like Tom shaved Bill, and shave would have some kind of, it has a fairly complex LCS, right? So it would be, Tom did something to Bill. Because of this, Bill no longer has a beard, right? Something like that. Bill had a beard, he had whiskers that were shaveable. I don't know what word it is, right? Had whiskers of some kind, and then those whiskers are no longer visible. Who knows what exactly beardless, some crazy thing like that. And the person acted upon and the person becoming beardless are the same. So there's a binding inside of the meaning part, right? And then X is the subject argument, and by just the normal rules, right? So this is all fairly straightforward. Tom shaved Bill. But you can also have a scenario like where you get a reflexive interpretation by simply leaving their object unexpressed. Bathe. So in verbs of grooming, this would be common in English, right? But it doesn't really happen all that much. But you can just leave that off, right? And we get this interpretation, right? Which is the default, right? You don't usually, people get shaved sometimes, but they usually shave themselves, right? And so I'm not sure if there's what the ultimate constraints are. Can women, if they shave their legs, say, can you say that? I shaved this morning. It works, right? So it's like shaved the default body part. Doesn't really exactly mean beardless, right? Beardless is just became hairless. Became hairless in the place that you would ordinarily want to not have hair, depending on your gender, whatever. But the key thing here is that we get a reflexive interpretation, necessarily. If I say, John shaved this morning, it wouldn't be possible for you to say that if he shaved his brother or shaved his girlfriend's legs, right? Would you? No, you automatically get it, right? Of course, you wouldn't do that. Guys don't do that, right? In some languages, then, what you do is you get reflexive morphology on the verb. And these are, in the Romance languages, these are characterized as clitics. They're sometimes written as separate words. There's no space in the writing system between them and the verb that they're associated with. Technically, they're probably not clitics. They probably are really affixes. But they glom onto some item. Because in Portuguese, like in English, the object position is after the verb. But this C thing goes in front of the verb, or goes on the verb. And it's actually going to be what it's looking for is, and I'm just abstracting away from this here, it's really looking for the I node. It gloms on to whatever's in the I node if there is one, and if there's an auxiliary, it would glom onto that, rather than onto the verb. But as we talked about before, actually in Portuguese what happens is that the verb moves up to the I node in this sort of situation. And so the reflexive and the verb are all perfectly happy together in that I node. But in any case, what we get here is the same thing, right? This is the same situation where we've got John shaved, right? But we would put the, I don't even know, in Brazilian Portuguese, they don't really care that much about having some dialects. You don't even need that say. Doesn't even have to be there. But for some dialects, it does. You probably actually wouldn't even say this in Brazilian. You would say, fez a barba. He made the beard, right? Is what you would actually say. But that would still be reflexive, right? Couldn't if you said, "O João fez a barba," that couldn't mean that he did shave someone else, could it?
Well, then you tack on the.
You'd have to tack on something else. Li fez a barba or something like that. Okay. But the key thing here is that missing DP must have a co-argument as its antecedent. So in these kinds of languages, actually, you get the way you do reflexivization is that you just leave off the objects of any verb. Give me any transitive verb as input, and I leave off the object argument, and I put a C on the verb, and I'm perfectly fine. So it has to have a co-argument. Something. So we haven't defined co-argument yet, but the antecedent of the missing. So there's a missing DP, and there's a morphology on the verb. It's saying, I've got a missing DP. And I interpret that according to certain constraints. And the constraints are, the missing DP must have a co-argument as its antecedent, something in the same clause, more or less. And it must, and the antecedent, moreover, it's a stronger constraint than you get in English. The antecedent must be the argument introduced in the specifier of VP slot. In other words, the antecedent must be the subject of the same verb. And here we have John is introduced as the specifier of VP, and then moves up to the subjective clause position later. Okay, so we've got, so this is one of the main things that syntactic theory looks at, one of the big pieces, binding theory and how languages would differ and how they're the same, what's universal, what isn't. It isn't clear that there are really strong universals with respect to this, but there's a fairly small number of parameters of variation. So if you have this kind of reflexive, the one that goes on the verb, then you've got a very strong constraint cross-linguistically that you're talking about co-arguments of the same verb. And you're also going to be talking about the subject necessarily being the antecedent. And often it's only subject and object. Those are the only ones that can be included in this relationship. It's not quite that strong for Portuguese and Romance languages, but the subject part is clearly the same. But then it gets a little bit complicated because you can have, you can actually have, well, let's see if I'm going to do here. This is where we've got something that's not shaving, it's just seeing, right? So it's just an ordinary verb. Give me any intransitive verb, and I can put the say on it, and I'm going to get the reflexive interpretation. So there's a missing object here. It's not being expressed, but we necessarily interpret it as being the same as the subject of the clause. So it means John saw himself. Now, here's where it gets, it can get a little bit complicated. So we can say the same thing is true about English up until a certain place, but we're going to have to modify this for English. But here we've got a problem with cases like this. Here we've got a case where John saw, so C really has how many arguments? Two, right? The perceiver, the seer, and whatever's seen, right? As far as we know, those are the only arguments. There's no evidence for there being more arguments than that. But we also can, we also know that you can say things like, oh, I'm doing Portuguese here still, right? So, but this is the same for English, by the way, right? You could say things like this. We could say, literally, John saw a guy die. Where a guy die is a propositional version of the percept argument of C, right? You have so here the analysis, and I think I'm just taking this from the textbook, but the standard analysis is this: is that you've got some kind of a small clause here. John died, but it's different than any other one that we've seen so far. How is it different? The ones that we've seen is imagine John dying. We've got an ing form of a verb, and we've got John, right? So let's think about the kinds of clauses that you can have. You can have two clauses. And notice that it just depends on what verb you pick. I want John, what I want, and then there's a propositional part there, right? John to die. It's fine, right? But not I want John die, right? But with C, the way it works is that you do it without either an ing or a to. So it's sort of an interesting construction. But what's interesting here, from the perspective of what we're looking at, is that we need to have a fairly sophisticated theory of how the constraints on reflexivization and pronominalization work when we take into account all of the different kinds of things that we get. So you can say things like John, so this would mean John saw a guy die, right? We've got the LCS of C is X sees Y. The instantiation of Y is another LCS. X becomes dead, right? And we get that sort of interpretation. And then we can also, we know that we've got just a clause here and not, so here's some evidence, right? I mean, I'm making a claim here that all you've got is 2 arguments for C. And if you do get, it's tricky, right? Because if you do get a DP, you can get the situation where you get the verb see, and then a DP, and then a verb in the infinitival form. That's what the structure is, right? And it's the same thing. In English and Portuguese, it's the same here, right? There's no 2. There's just a verb, and in both languages, the verb is in its infinitival form. But it's perfectly fine to put in, it's clear that that DP that comes after the verb is not its argument. It's not a complement of the verb, at least in semantic terms or underlyingly, because you can get things like this, right? Where you have a verb that has no subject. The verb rain in Portuguese would just be, if I say, what happened today? And I want to say it rained, it would be choveu, without anything at all there, no subject at all of any kind. And at most, what you would say is that it's got an empty pronoun. And the empty pronoun, if you want to say, well, you've got to have a subject, then you see, notice what you'd have to say for Portuguese. If every verb has to have a subject, then you have to say, well, yeah, you satisfy that by your subject being a dummy pronoun that is necessarily empty phonetically, right? You could say that, right? But in any case, it doesn't really matter because the point here is that when there is an object after C, it's not an argument of C. It's an argument of the embedded clause, and therefore we can put anything in there. Virtually any clause structure can go in underneath C. Okay, then we could have, could have this, right, where we've got an empty subject of die, even though die does have an argument, right? The verb die does have an argument, but if we do that, then we put the se on there, and we get a reflexive interpretation, right? So here we've got a situation where the reflexive interpretation is not necessarily tied between the subject and the object of a verb. That's the normal situation. But you just have to be close enough in some sense, right, in order for this to work. And it's the same thing in English, by the way. We're going through this in Portuguese because Portuguese has a stronger constraint on reflexivization. But English allows the same kind of thing, right? You can say, John saw himself die in a nightmare, for example, right? It's perfectly fine, right? So we've got what we need to handle is this constraint that the reflexive has to be close enough to its antecedent. And in broad terms, argument of the same verb, but not quite, because you've got cases like this, right, where we've got scenarios like this. So that's sort of the problem, and the way that this can be. Well, you can see that how it's not like anything goes, right? So here's where you have to sort of get the constraints right. So you could say John saw a guy kill. A guy is an argument of kill, right? But if we put an empty thing in that slot, then we're going to just get garbage, right? There's no way you could say John, just like in English, right? You couldn't say John saw a guy kill himself, meaning where himself goes with John, right? Absolutely impossible, right? So there's the same kind of constraint where your antecedent has to be in the same domain, right? It's tricky, right? If I'm a reflexive element, I have to have an antecedent. I have to be interpreted with something very close by in some close domain. But it doesn't actually even have to be a semantic co-argument. But it can't. There's some kind of stronger constraint. So let's stop there for now, just so you get a sense of what the problem is if you're going to be dealing with reflexives and pronouns and prose and all of those kinds of things, and where can they occur? there are very tight constraints that are key to the syntactic structure. And by examining those, we unpack what the syntactic structure is at some point.